Hi, everyone. In this study, we investigated how the process of perceptual learning for speech unfolds when listeners are exposed to multiple talkers. So, talkers often differ in how they produce their speech sounds. Listeners are able to adjust to these idiosyncratic differences, and this learning is often guided by contextual information. So, for instance, you might imagine a talker who produces her s sound atypically. Maybe she produces it a bit more like a sh sound. And if you hear her produce this atypical "s" in a context like episode, you can use your knowledge that episode is a word and episode is not to infer that she is producing a "s." And then if you meet the same talker again and she produces the same sound in an ambiguous context, maybe something that sounds like a mix of sign and shine, you can use your previous experience with this talker to interpret the sound as a "s." So through learning, you've updated your beliefs about how this talker produces her speech sounds, or as we often say, you've updated your generative model for that talker. Previous work by Kralik and Samuel showed that if listeners are exposed to two talkers, one of whom produces "s" strangely and one of whom produces "sh" strangely, listeners can maintain separate beliefs about these two talkers. So listeners know that if they hear an ambiguous sound from one talker, they should interpret it as a "s," but if the ambiguous "sh" blend comes from the other talker, they should interpret it as a "sh." Now, critically, this previous study exposed listeners to the two talkers one at a time, so listeners only had to update one generative model at a time. In ecological speech perception, however, listeners are often exposed to two talkers simultaneously. And so in the current study, we compared how perceptual learning of speech differs when listeners are exposed to two talkers, one after the other, compared to when there is intermixed exposure to the two talkers. First, we wanted to replicate Kralik and Samuel's finding to show that listeners are able to learn the phonetic details of two talkers when they hear them one at a time. So we exposed listeners to two talkers, one of whom produced an ambiguous sh blend in S-biased contexts like episode, and the other who produced the same ambiguous sound in sh-biased contexts. During exposure trials, participants simply had to indicate which talker they were hearing. Afterward, listeners completed a phonetic categorization task where they heard the talker produce stimuli on a continuum from sign to shine. In this first experiment, listeners completed both the exposure and phonetic categorization task for one voice before moving on to the second voice. We found that with relatively few exposures to each talker's voice, only 32 trials per talker, of which 16 contained the ambiguous fricative, listeners were able to update their beliefs about how these talkers produce their speech sounds. Specifically, participants' categorization of ambiguous stimuli from the sign-shine continuum depended on whether they had previously heard the talker produce the ambiguous sound in S-biased or Esh-biased contexts. So, having verified that listeners could adapt to our two talkers when exposure to their voices was blocked, we then conducted a second experiment where we tested how well they did when their exposure to the two talkers was intermixed. So that is, before they did any phonetic categorization trials, they heard both talkers, and talker identity varied from trial to trial during the exposure phase. Now, in this second experiment, we had 4 groups of participants. Some participants received the same amount of exposure as in the first experiment, whereas other participants received twice as much exposure to the two talkers. We also manipulated whether participants received feedback during the exposure task, since feedback is thought to encourage the use of an implicit reflexive learning system that's ideal for speech sound learning. We found learning in our 2 groups of participants who received double exposure to the stimuli, evidenced by a difference in the categorization of ambiguous stimuli depending on whether the talker previously produced those sounds in S-biased or Esh-biased contexts. This effect was marginally significant in the group that did not receive feedback and significant in the group that did. So these results show that listeners can maintain distinct sets of beliefs about how two talkers produce their speech sounds. When listeners are exposed to the two talkers one after the other, learning occurs with relatively few exposures to each talker. By contrast, when they're exposed to the two talkers in an intermixed fashion, they require additional exposure before they can learn. We suggest that this is because when listeners must simultaneously update 2 generative models, they have to first select which talker's model to update, and juggling between 2 generative models poses a cognitive cost. Overall, our results clarify how perceptual learning of multiple talkers occurs in naturalistic situations where exposure to the 2 talkers is likely to be intermixed.